Crisis does not begin when power becomes violent. It begins earlier, when evaluation arrives before encounter, when life is met first, not as presence, but as something to be handled, not when the body is struck, when the soul begins asking permission to appear, not when truth is forbidden, when truth begins rehearsing for reception. That is the age. An age in which the living thing is greeted first as a problem of framing. A face, a child, a feeling, a gift, a sentence, a body, a future. Not received, processed, not met, managed. That is the turn. And once you see it, you see the same grammar everywhere. The pressure to become admissible, selectable, legible, safe enough for circulation, readable enough to rank, soft enough to keep. The palace is one form of it. The line is another. The administration is its inward completion. 3 masks, 1 appetite. Not because every form of order is evil, not because all care is corruption, but because something breaks when handling becomes the primary way a civilization meets reality. When the desk replaces the person, when the score arrives before the face, when the review begins before the thing has even appeared. That is the age. A civilization that no longer knows how to let anything arrive before evaluating it. That is the law beneath all of it. The file before the face. The score before the cry. The dashboard before the child. The memo before the thought. The gate before the meeting. And once that law settles into a culture, it does not stay in institutions. It moves. First it governs appearance. Then it reaches for continuity. Then it installs itself inside the soul. The palace is not a building. It is a condition. A pressure in the air, a tone in the voice, a slight tightening in the jaw before speech, a gate that enters the blood. It decides who may appear, who may remain visible, who may return, who may be forgiven, who may still be called dangerous after being made useful. It has no address because it lives in permission, in access, in appetite, in the soft panic behind the eyes that ask, will they still let me through? That is the palace. Not the throne, the threshold. It does not begin as horror. It begins as relief. Your call gets answered. Your name carries. Doors part. The room brightens when you enter. Your image moves ahead of you. Even your shadow gets there first. You feel lifted, chosen, confirmed. Even your posture changes a little. Even your mouth begins learning the smile the room prefers. You say, I made it. No. You were admitted. There's a difference. The palace never says you are free. It says you may remain. For now. That is why the palace is more dangerous than a prison. A prison frightens the body. The palace seduces the soul. A prison shows you bars. The palace shows you a mirror. That is the first trick. Not pain, recognition. Not punishment, reflection. A face returned to itself with the room already inside it. The deepest horror is not destruction. It is retention. Not being killed, but being kept. Not being erased, but being circulated. Not losing your gift, but feeling your gift wired into a system that feeds on it. Not being silenced, but being allowed to speak in ways that no longer threaten the room. The room lets you sing. It just owns the microphone. The palace does not fear talent. It feeds on talent. It glamorizes charisma, then bolts it to the floor. It does not fear rebellion. It fears only the rebel who does not need re-entry. Crushing is primitive. Crushing makes martyrs. The palace prefers something cleaner. It flatters. It elevates. It crowns. It amplifies. It teaches the captive to need the light exactly the way the room requires. That is how domination matures. It stops looking like force. It starts looking like access. A comeback is not freedom. A comeback is clearance. You were reviewed, measured, priced, processed, made safe enough for circulation again. So the figure walks back into smoke and light, and people say, "Look, he has returned." Returned where? To the same gate. Only now he knows the terms. Only now his body knows them too. The slight brace in the chest, the quick scan of faces, the private calculation before the first word. The pupils narrowing like an animal stepping from dark backstage into an engineered sun. That is why resurrection feels haunted. It is not resurrection. It is formatting. The person is translated back into acceptable form. The edge remains rounded. The danger remains insured. And sometimes the figure knows it. That is a darker possibility. Not innocence. Knowledge. The knowledge that the stage is a trap, that return is not freedom, that the crowd is compromised, that the room will use the body and call it triumph. And still, he walks into the light. Sometimes a person is trapped in revealing the trap at the same time. Sometimes the room becomes visible precisely because it is feeding. That is harder to look at. Because then the figure is not merely hypocrite or martyr. He is a site of collision. A body where appetite, revelation, ego, dependence, sacrifice, and spectacle meet under the lights. The palace can sell the scream, package the wound, turn rupture into rollout, and it does not stay outside. No one has to threaten you. You begin doing the work yourself. You have done it. You have checked the room before finishing the thought. You have softened a sentence while the heat that made it was still alive in your chest. You have felt a real reaction rise into throat, jaw, face, and reached first for the version that keeps the door open. Will this close the door? Will this poison the name? Will this freeze the room? Will this kill the invitation? Will this make return impossible? That voice is the palace. The chandelier has already been hung inside the ribs. Because you learned what survival feels like under a gate. Now the gate speaks in your own tongue. The inner palace is worse than the outer one. The outer palace can be hated. The inner palace feels like wisdom. You call it maturity, timing, strategy, realism. And maybe sometimes it is. That is what makes it lethal. The palace does not conquer by making you lie. It conquers by making betrayal sound reasonable. Just a little patience, just a little softening, just a little translation, enough to stay admissible. That is how people disappear without vanishing. Visible, but unavailable to themselves. The palace studies one thing, not your politics, not your slogans, your need. Your terror of obscurity, your ache for witness, your hunger to matter, your fear that without the room you will evaporate. It builds the room out of that. That is why the palace is beautiful. It has to be. If the cage looked like a cage, more people would leave. So it gleams, it flatters, it raises the body into myth. It surrounds dependence with ceremony. It lets the leash wear velvet. The deepest prison is the one that lets you keep your reflection. That is the whole room. Reflection. The feeling of being real in the eyes of the structure. That is the drug. Not applause. Confirmation. Invitation. Relevance. Access. Return. The warm animal feeling that the room still has use for you. And the tragedy is not that the king falls. It is that the king needs the room. Not that the prophet is mocked. That the prophet adjusts his tone for re-entry. Not that the artist is silenced. That the artist becomes receivable. Absorbable. That is the law. Not truth, not beauty, not courage. Absorbability. The crowd helps. The crowd wants blood, but arranged. Transgression with parking. The palace is distributed. Contracts, streams, brands, handlers, press, algorithms, insurance, taste, panic. The world organized as a gate. Live under a gate long enough and you bring it everywhere. Into the work, into the body, into the sentence before it is spoken. Into the shoulders, into the smile, into the hand reaching for the handle. You leave the building and keep kneeling. That is the first mutation. Life becomes appearance under review. The self becomes something that must remain admissible, but power never stops where it first succeeds. A gate that learns to govern visibility will eventually reach for continuity. The palace does not remain around the body. It enters the blood. And procreation is not romance. It is continuity. Not the self surviving, the pattern continuing. Not immortality, transmission. Bone becoming bone. A face returning through altered flesh. Old weather entering new nerves. That is the line. The species moving through you. You say, I am starting a family. Yes. And something older says, continue. That is the beauty. And the violence. Because birth feels intimate. Continuity does not. It uses longing, uses lust, uses loneliness, uses tenderness, uses the need to be seen, uses the ache for home. Love is real. It is also one of life's delivery systems. Genes are not fate. They are recurrence. A carried code, a repeated instruction, a pattern refusing to die by refusing to stay in one body. The dead return, not as themselves, as tendencies, as thresholds, as illnesses, as appetites, as reflexes, as styles of fear, as ways of withholding, as ways of breaking. In the jaw, in the gait, in the flinch, in the silence that falls over a table for reasons no child could name. Not resurrection, return. And the return is never clean. Life continues by slippage. That slip is mutation. A changed letter, a bent sequence, a defect, a gift, a wound, a door. Most of it disappears. Some of it survives. Some of it becomes the future. Repeat, but not exactly. We are the children of accidents that held. That is the secret. Not purity, persistence. Not design, luck that made it through. Then desire enters. Not only what lives, what is chosen, what is wanted, what is pursued, what gets touched, what gets kept, what gets to continue. That is sexual selection. Biology passing through taste. And human taste is never innocent. It arrives already arranged by status, shame, class, fantasy, money, trauma, beauty standards, religion, image, by power. So reproduction is never just biology, it is civilizational selecting through bodies. The body choosing inside a script it did not write. That is why family is more than shelter. It is an inheritance system. Not only of genes, of panic, of silence, of speech, humor, disgust, prayer, ambition, of the emotional climate. Family does not only raise children, it reproduces a world. The eyes get passed down. So does the fear, the jaw, the temper, the style of begging, the style of withholding, the reflex to disappear, the reflex to dominate, the way the shoulders rise before conflict, the way a mouth hardens around love. Biology lays the track, environment runs the train, then consciousness arrives, and man does not stop at inheriting. He starts grading inheritance, ranking it, cleaning it, improving it, judging which traits deserve tomorrow. That is where darkness becomes orderly. Not wild, administrative. Not with banners, with preferences. With 1,000 small recoils. With the old whisper, the strong should continue, the weak should not. This is the modern superstition, not science. Atmosphere. The belief that winning proves worth. The belief that winning proves worth. That fitness proves rightness. That failure reveals defect. That whoever survives the sort must have deserved the future. It is ranking mistaken for truth. And you feel it everywhere now. In dating and hiring, in branding and fitness, in self-help and therapy language, in parenting, in the feed. Be sharper, be hotter, be calmer, be fitter, be visible, be chosen, be optimized. Do not lag, do not fall, do not pass weakness forward. That is the sermon now. Not survive, curate. Selection was always here. That is not new. What is new is the interface, the visible hand, the menu, the dashboard. The species no longer says, let the line move. It says, show me the options. Technology did not invent the pressure. It made it ambient. It put the audition in the pocket, the mirror in the hand, the jury in the room. Now the species does not only perform, it self-performs. The profile, the filtered face, the quantified mood, the private ministry of self-PR. And everyone learns the same lesson. Be legible, be desirable, be market safe, be selectable again tomorrow. A person no longer simply lives, he presents, tracks, tunes, refines, tests the self against response. The self becomes interface, desire becomes analytics, charm becomes strategy, a life starts bending toward what can be received. Profile, score, filter, preference, optimization, risk reduction, better outcome. The same grammar everywhere. The face becomes a feed. Then the self becomes a project. Then the child appears as a setting. The nursery glows blue before the child has lungs. And once a civilization learns to curate the self at scale, it will want to curate birth. Of course it will. Culture that edits photos, edits speech, edits mood, edits public feeling will not stop at the embryo. Once the embryo becomes readable, the hand trained by the touchscreen will want the genome next. That is the threshold. The line has learned to read itself. The genome wrote the future in secret. Now the future can read the script. And once it can be read, it can be scored. Once it can be scored, it can be ranked. Once it can be ranked, it can be selected. Once it can be selected, power enters the womb. That is the new palace. Not around birth, inside it. The old palace asked, who gets in? This one asks, what gets born? And it will not say, purify. It has better manners now. It will say, risk, resilience, readiness, better outcomes, the best chance. It will say, we are only being careful. We are only reducing suffering. We are only helping. That is how the old hunger returns. Not with banners, with options. Not with doctrine, with dashboards. The words get cleaner, the sorting does not. And this is what makes the threshold difficult. Some intervention is mercy. That must be said plainly. A child spared a lethal disease is not an abstraction. It is relief. It is love refusing passivity before ruin. No parent stands over a bed of wires and thinks in slogans. No one who has watched a small chest labor mistakes suffering for theory. It is a parent unable to watch the body be taken apart if a hand can intervene. That is real. That is where the door opens. And no one opens it thinking, now let us redesign the species. They think something human. If this can be prevented, why would I permit it? If this suffering can be reduced, why would I stand aside? If one letter can destroy a life, why would I defend the letter? That is how it begins. Not with cruelty, with refusal to watch. And that refusal is difficult to argue with, because much of the time it should not be argued with. That is the problem. The line does not move first through evil. It moves through care. But the door does not stay where care opened it. Because the same mind that says, I cannot let my child suffer this, can be taught slowly to say, I cannot let my child start lower. Then, I cannot let my child be vulnerable to exclusion. Then, I cannot leave this to chance if chance can be managed. That is how management enters love. Not through hatred, through fear trained by a ranking world. The The parent no longer fears only pain. The parent feels disadvantage, lag, mediocrity, exclusion, humiliation, falling behind. So the parent says, I'm not trying to perfect the child. I'm trying to spare the child from the age. That sentence is sincere. It is also where the logic turns. Risk, advantage, likelihood, preparedness, resilience, best chance. The child has not arrived yet. The sorting already has. A cursor blinking over a life with no voice yet. First disease, then predisposition, then vulnerability, then lowered advantage. Categories blur. That is what pressure does. And once they blur, selection feels responsible. The edited child becomes tempting for the same reason the edited self became normal. The age cannot tolerate uncurated arrival. It wants preview, forecast, control. The child must not only be welcomed, the child must be de-risked. That is the mutation. Not in the gene, in the frame. Life no longer arrives first. Evaluation arrives first. Then life comes through it. And once evaluation comes first, love acquires a shadow, expectation, a colder kind. The child is still wanted, yes, but wanted how? As gift or as outcome? As stranger or as proof? As person or as successful settings? That is the split. Not whether the child is loved, what kind of love is waiting. Because a selected child does not enter an empty room. That room is already full. Screens going softly in the dark, scores, thresholds, predictions, prevented futures, rejected versions, silent exclusions. The file before the face, the score before the cry, the dashboard before the name. You feel it later. In the glance when development drifts, in the panic when temperament resists forecast, in the little pause before reassurance, in the body of the parent going tight around what was supposed to unfold cleanly. In the private thought no one says aloud, we did everything right. Why are you still difficult? That is the new wound. The child is burdened, not only by what the parents failed to do, but by what they tried to preempt. By the invisible sentence, you were filtered, and still the child exceeds. The unplanned sorrow, the inconvenient gift, the flaw that becomes force, the deviation that becomes vision, the strangers no model would have honored in advance. Systems can measure variance. They cannot welcome emergence. So the age becomes obsessed with data. Earlier, cleaner, deeper data, behavioral data, genomic data, polygenic data, continuous tracking, permanent foresight. Because uncertainty now feels like negligence. Prediction feels like care. That is the lie hidden inside prudence. Uncertainty is not only danger, it is also the condition in which a life can arrive without having justified itself first. Child used to arrive through not knowing, not ignorance, exposure, a room, a crib, air moving through curtains, no forecast glowing at the foot of the bed. No one knew, not fully, that not knowing protected something. Now the file opens before the face appears. That reversal changes everything. Because once life must justify itself in advance, givenness starts to look like inefficiency. The old shock was, here you are. The new mood is, let's see. This is violence without spectacle. Not against the body, against its givenness, against the fact that a person once arrived without passing through preference first. Now givenness becomes optional. And once it becomes optional, mystery becomes bad planning. That is the deeper conquest. Not only the management of fame, not even the management of birth, the training of the species to experience reality itself as interface. Scroll, adjust, filter, refine, delete, enhance, optimize. Try again. That grammar moves from screen to self, from self to desire, from desire to parenting, from parenting to hereditary. The logic stays the same. Why accept what can be improved? That sentence will do enormous damage, because it sounds intelligent. But there are dimensions of life that do not improve by becoming manageable. They diminish. A mystery made fully operational is no longer a mystery. A child approaches platform is no longer fully a child, and no one reaches that far unless something in the human being has already been prepared for it. No culture curates birth at scale until people have first learned to curate themselves from within. Before the embryo is scored, the soul has already been trained to speak in metrics. Before the child is filtered, the adult has become a clerk. The gate enters the blood enters the file enters the mind. And the administration does not arrive in a uniform. It arrives in a person. A friend, a lover, a coworker, a sibling, a soft voice with dead language, a face you used to meet directly, now carrying an office behind it. That is how it works. It takes a personality and installs a desk. Not a soul, a function. Not presence, procedure. The administration begins when a human being stops encountering life and starts processing it. Not living, handling. Not listening, assessing. Not speaking, positioning. Not meeting another person, managing one. That is the final turn. Not because all interpretation is domination. Not because every act of caution is false. The violence begins when nothing is allowed to appear before being processed. When phrasing replaces contact, when safety replaces presence, when a person becomes a case before he has even become a person in the room. When a person becomes a case before he has even become a person in the room. You know this voice. You've heard it in other people. You've heard it in yourself. You have felt yourself editing a sentence while the feeling that produced it was still warm in the body, still in the throat, still in the chest, still trying to become language before the clerk arrived. That clipped, careful, bloodless tone. The voice that never risks contact. The voice that cannot simply respond because it is too busy administering the exchange. Everything passes through the inner office, under fluorescent weather. Every silence gets flagged. Every expression gets interpreted. Every conflict becomes a case. Every feeling is translated into acceptable language before it is allowed to exist. Nothing raw survives. It does not need tyrants. It needs ordinary people who are afraid of what has not been pre-labeled. People who cannot bear ambiguity, cannot bear silence, cannot bear a face they cannot immediately classify, cannot bear a sentence that does not arrive already domesticated. So they administer. They administer the room. They administer the mood. They administer the pace. They administer what can be said, what can be implied, and what can be felt without becoming a problem. They call this maturity. Usually it is with good posture. Kafka understood this. The nightmare is not simply judgment. It is judgment without origin. Accusation without explanation. Procedure without center. Punishment without a clear crime. A system nobody fully understands, yet everybody serves. No throne, no obvious monster, no final author. Just corridors, desks, notices, deferrals, minor officials, invisible law. No one knows where the authority begins. Everyone behaves as if it must be obeyed. The court has moved inside the person. Now the clerk lives in the mind. The judge lives in the nerves. The stenographer sits behind the eyes. The little prosecutor wakes with you and follows you into every conversation. You feel something. It gets reviewed. You want to speak. The jaw tightens. The tongue stalls. A phrasing committee appears. You want to be silent. A form appears. You want to respond directly from instinct, from pain, from humor, from the old animal intelligence of being alive. But the Bureau interrupts. Please clarify. Please contextualize. Please regulate your tone. Please present yourself in terms the system can process. And people call this communication. It is not communication. It is self-surveillance performed out loud. That is why everyone is tired. Not because life is hard. Because they are all working 2 jobs. First they live, then they administer the living. They feel, then they monitor the feeling. They speak, then they audit the speech. They desire, then they run compliance on the desire. They grieve, then they translate grief into a framework so nobody has to touch the real thing. The self splits. One half bleeds. The other half takes notes. That is not consciousness. That is occupation. And once people are occupied inwardly, they begin occupying one another. Not through doctrine, through personality, through wounded egos, through cowardice, through cheap narcotic of having a little authority over the breathing chaos. Because the ego loves administration. The ego loves a desk, loves a category, loves a superior tone, loves the chance to stand above life and sort it into bins. The ego is never more pathetic than when it mistakes management for wisdom. Some people do not want truth. They want jurisdiction. They do not want intimacy. They want controlled access. They do not want friendship. They want an improved exchange. They do not want love. They want a negotiated system of disclosures, permissions, calibrated needs, and moral leverage. They do not want to meet another soul. They want to administer a manageable version of one. So that is what they do. Friends administer each other, lovers administer each other, coworkers administer each other, families administer each other. Everywhere you turn, someone is trying to become a minor official of your reality, correcting your tone, interpreting your face, framing your intent, assigning your motives, reducing your ambiguity, dragging your living contradictions into the fluorescent little courtroom inside their mind. It is vile because it is small, too weak to face life directly, so it hides behind process, too weak to say, I am afraid, too weak to say, I do not understand you, too weak to let another person remain partly mysterious, so it converts mystery into management. A free person can encounter what he does not fully understand. An administered person cannot. He has to name it, frame it, place it, reduce it. He has to make it legible enough to stop feeling threatened by it. That is why these people are always reading faces like forms. Too much, too intense, too distant, too vague, too emotional, too cold, too unclear, too unsafe, too unprocessed. They cannot let anything stand. They have to stamp it. And they think this makes them intelligent. Usually it means they are conquered. The people who administer most aggressively are almost always the most administered. They are the defeated. Their spontaneity is gone. Their silence is gone. The interiority is gone. The old wild room in them is gone. All that remains is protocol. And because they have lost access to the ungoverned part of themselves, they cannot tolerate it in anyone else. So they come at you with concern, with policy, with calibrated language, with managerial empathy, with the rituals of people who no longer know how to feel without also supervising the feeling. That is why real speech collapses. Because speech requires risk, requires contact, requires the possibility of being wrong without instantly converting the whole thing into self-protection. The administrative person cannot do that. He cannot simply be. He cannot simply hear. He cannot stand in the open field of another presence without reaching for a clipboard. So adulthood becomes mutual processing, mutual paperwork, people stamping invisible forms onto one another and calling it growth, calling it safety, calling it communication, calling it emotional intelligence. Most of it is just fear with a vocabulary. And beneath that fear is grief, because something has been lost. Silence first. Silence always dies first. Not outer silence, inner silence. The chamber where a thought could form before it was judged. The the place where a feeling could remain nameless for a minute, the dark room where intuition could move like an animal through tall grass without being dragged into language, the old private field where a person belonged to himself, where breath could settle, where the face could go unarranged, where the nervous system did not have to present a case. Because that room cannot be managed. Silence is where the human being is still partly unreachable, still opaque, still sovereign, still not fully translated into the terms of the system. So the room gets flooded with frameworks, with self-explanation, with corrective inner monologue, with little rehearsals for imaginary tribunals, with endless anticipatory defense. Cold aquarium light filling the old dark chamber. The mind becomes a courthouse that never closes, and then people wonder why they cannot think, because thinking requires a little unadministered darkness. Something has to be allowed to gather before it is forced to explain itself. But the administrative spirit cannot wait. It must intervene immediately. It must regulate immediately. It must narrate immediately. It must make everything legible before anything real has had time to appear. That is the whole age. The palace taught the self to seek admissibility. The line taught love to speak in thresholds. The administration teaches the soul to supervise itself. The mirror, the dashboard, the desk. Different objects. One civilization. A civilization that no longer knows how to let a thing arrive before evaluating it. A civilization that meets the artist as risk, the child as outcome, the feeling as case, the person as profile, the mystery as inefficiency, the future as a menu. The gate enters the blood enters the file enters the mind, and the mind begins policing what the world no longer needs to police from outside. That is the completed system, not chains, reflex, not only obedience, preemption, not merely censorship, self-translation. And still, there's a way out. Not reform, not kinder management, not a better dashboard, not a holier mirror, not a softer cage. The way out is more severe than that. The room stops getting a vote inside you. That is where it begins. A person who no longer needs the palace to confirm he exists. A parent who can still meet a child as a rival, not manage release. A mind that resigns from the inner post. Resign. That is the word. Resign from the need to review every feeling before it is allowed to live. Resign from the reflex to interpret before you've even perceived. Resign from the vanity of thinking everything in front of you must pass through your language to become real. Resign from your little jurisdiction. Step down. Leave the desk unoccupied. Let the gate close. Let the invitations die. Let the reflected self starve. Let the child exceed the file. Let the person remain partly unread. Let love remain risk before it becomes negotiation. Let grief be grief before it becomes phrasing. Let thought gather in the dark before the tribunal arrives. Hold still. At first it will feel like stupidity, like loss of handle, like failure to optimize, like irrelevance, like falling behind, like speaking without insurance, like exposing the child to chance, like being nobody, like standing there with your own pulse in your throat and no procedure to hide behind. Good. That is the machinery losing power. Stay there. Because freedom is not glamorous. It is severe. It may cost scale, comfort, protection, relevance, the self you built in the room, the fantasy that management can save you from mystery. It may cost the mirror. It may cost the dashboard. It may cost the clerk's illusion of control, but something returns there that no system can produce. Encounter, givenness, unadministered life. Not everything unscored is lost. Some things only live there. A window left open at night, air moving through the room with no one there to rank it. The face before the file, the cry before the score, the thought before the memo, the love before the negotiation, the soul before the department. That is what the age cannot understand, because it understands only what can be handled. So keep one room in you outside its reach, one corridor it cannot light, one feeling it cannot format, one love it cannot administer, one thought it cannot stamp, one child it cannot reduce to settings, one silence it cannot flood, one pulse it cannot turn into policy. Protect that room, not because it is pure, because it is alive. The palace survives by convincing you exclusion is death. It is not. The line narrows by convincing you uncertainty is negligence. It is not. The administration rules by convincing you constant supervision is consciousness. It is not. Sometimes exclusion is the first clean breath. Sometimes uncertainty is the only condition in which a life can arrive without having justified itself first. Sometimes the first real moment of thought is when the inner clerk falls silent and nothing rushes in to replace him. That is how the age loosens. Not burned, seen. Seen so clearly its language no longer enters the blood. Seen so fully its mirror no longer works. Seen so deeply its dashboard no longer defines the child. Seen so calmly its clerk no longer speaks for the soul. And what remains, after the gate, after the score, after the desk, was never inside it.